Imagine waking up to the deafening grind of concrete mixers tearing apart the creek that's run peacefully behind your home since before the Civil War. Diesel fumes mingle with the dust of crushed limestone, stinging your nose as you watch $80,000 of HOA funds poured into what used to be a pristine mountain stream. From her white Tesla, HOA President Brenda Hartwell smugly announces, "It's for flood control." Too bad she had no idea she was dealing with a retired Army Corps hydrologist to me and that her project was basically a disaster waiting to happen. Half a year later, her $1 million house sits in waist-deep swamp water, foundation cracking like cheap plaster, while my rundown property is completely dry. The FBI arrives on her doorstep, and that concrete drainage channel she once bragged about is about to ruin her life. My name's Dale Brennan. I'm 58, and until not long ago I thought the most stressful part of my day was searching for carburetor parts for a 1972 Harley Sportster. Turns out I was wrong. The real threat was an HOA president who thought her real estate license magically turned her into a hydro engineer. I inherited my grandfather's 2-acre piece of heaven in what used to be rural Colorado back when Willowbrook was just rolling pasture land and HOA stood for herd of Angus. My grandfather William Brennan was a combat engineer who survived Normandy and came home determined to build something peaceful and lasting. This creek was his sanctuary. Ever since I retired from the Army Corps of Engineers, I started every morning the exact same way: a coffee on the porch, listening to Cottonwood Creek ripple over smooth granite stones. The smell of motor oil from my workshop mixed with the scent of wet willow bark, hammer strikes echoing across clear water at dawn. My boots still crunch across the gravel paths my grandfather laid by hand in 1948. My wife, Martha, fourth-grade teacher with the patience of a saint, would get me through harder days than I ever expected. Our kids are grown now, scattered across the country. Jessica's saving lives in Portland. Mike is debug and code in Austin. They both definitely inherited their grandfather's stubbornness. The reason our property is so special isn't the old ranch house, and it definitely isn't my cluttered workshop full of vintage motorcycle parts. It's the 400 yards of creek flowing through the land are protected by water rights established in 1873, older than the state of Colorado, older than electricity, and certainly older than some suburban queen with an attitude problem. Then Willowbrook estates popped up around us like overpriced mushrooms after a rainstorm of 47 homes averaging $900,000, mostly people from California escaping their own home nightmares. The irony was thicker than the creek's morning mist. Enter our antagonist, Brenda Hartwell. 52 years old, president of the HOA, and self-appointed ruler of suburban perfection, straight out of Marin County, radiating that unique blend of entitlement and ignorance only found in real estate agents selling overvalued homes to desperate buyers. White Tesla, vanity plate, sold for you. Pearl earrings worn like symbols of conquest. Her husband works in Denver finance. Her kids go to a private school where they probably teach that people like me just made different economic choices. Their $1.2 million colonial sits right on the edge of my creek, perfectly manicured until the moment nature begins. The first shot came on a Tuesday morning filled with the smell of fresh coffee, a broken bar, and lawsuits. I received an official HOA violation notice via certified mail. Of course, unsightly storage of automotive parts visible from neighboring properties. Fine, $200 per day until compliance. I read it twice. The absurdity sank in like cold creek water on dry earth. Here's what Brenda's high-priced lawyers didn't realize. My property predates their HOA by 80 years. My grandfather's deed includes mineral rights, water rights, and a permanent exemption from future development restrictions. They were betting an old mechanic wouldn't know basic property law. The in-person meeting went exactly the way you'd expect. Vanilla candles and entitlement in the air. Brenda smiled that rehearsed realtor smile and suggested I might be happier somewhere with more flexible property standards. Translation: somewhere poor people belong. I responded with a certified letter of my own explaining that HOA covenants don't apply to grandfathered properties. Basic real estate law. Day one stuff if you've ever dealt with water rights or easements. Her retaliation was fast and expensive. Anonymous complaints to the county about illegal business operations on my land. Apparently, Fixing motorcycles is suspicious to people who hire someone else to change their oil. A county inspector tore through my workshop for 2 hours. He found nothing wrong except my filing system, but it still cost me $1,200 in legal fees just to prove I wasn't running a chop shop. That was only Brenda testing the waters. Literally, the real nightmare started when she discovered how complicated water rights are in Colorado. Because in Brenda's world, people like me, people with calloused hands and property that doesn't vote the whole rule said don't deserve power. That's when I realized this wasn't about motorcycles. This was war. Spring snowmelt ran heavy that year. Cottonwood Creek sang louder than usual as it rushed over the Beaver Dam just upstream. The sound of fast water mixed with wet willow bark and mist hovering over the surface. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it became the soundtrack to Brenda's next brilliant legal tactic. This time she hired Payton and Associates, a Denver law firm specializing in what they politely call environmental property disputes, which is fancy legal talk for how to screw your neighbor using government regulations. Their move was ruthless and simple: file a nuisance water flow complaint with the county, accusing my property of causing dangerous runoff that threatened the million-dollar homes downstream. The paperwork arrived thick as a phone book of 57 pages of technical jargon basically saying, make the old guy prove his 150-year-old creek won't flood our clients' mansions. They were trying to force me into a $50,000 environmental impact study, the kind that takes 2 years and requires hiring consultants who probably golf with those same lawyers on weekends. Martha found me that evening standing knee-deep in the creek, boots squishing in the mud as I checked flow patterns with my grandfather's old surveyor's rod. "What are you thinking?" she asked in that gentle teacher voice that always means she sees trouble coming. I stared at the water and said, "I'm thinking Brenda's fancy lawyers just declared war. They made a $50,000 mistake," I muttered, watching the water curl around a boulder my grandfather had placed by hand back in 1953. And they picked the wrong retired engineer to play games with. One thing 3 decades in the Army Corps taught me is that lawyers rely on complicated environmental jargon because they assume the average person won't understand it. What they never consider is that some of us actually designed the systems they're trying to weaponize. It's like listening to someone try to explain how your own engine works when you're the one who built it. So I called Pete Morrison, an old buddy who now works at the Colorado Water Authority. Took him all of 10 minutes to find the fatal flaw in Payton and Associates' case. Their entire argument relied on watershed maps from 1967, back when there was no interstate, half the upstream neighborhoods didn't exist, and modern storm drainage wasn't even part of the equation. Pete laughed when he saw it. "Dale, those maps are about as current as a rotary phone. Want me to send the real data? This is going to be embarrassing." Modern geological surveys told a completely different story. Instead of contributing to flooding, my section of the creek actually prevented it by creating natural retention during spring runoff. Those granite boulders my grandfather placed weren't just pretty, they formed a makeshift flood control system before anyone used the term in polite conversation. But it got even better. Back in engineering school, I learned about the prior appropriation doctrine. Colorado water law boils down to first in time, first in right. Since my family had documented water usage going back to 1873, our rights superseded anything filed after that, including Willowbrook Estates, Brenda's home, and probably her grandchildren's future complaints. I spent the weekend in my workshop surrounded by my grandfather's engineering notebooks and modern county maps, connecting dots Brenda's lawyers didn't even know existed. The familiar smell of motor oil and old paper mixed together as I sketched out my response on graph paper. It felt like I had the old man looking over my shoulder. That Monday, I filed my own complaint. This wasn't just a defense, it was a counteroffensive. I demanded that Brenda's HOA pay for a proper environmental study. Since their entire lawsuit was based on outdated and misleading data, I attached Pete's report, which showed how their development actually increased downstream flood risk. Rodriguez, the county water commissioner and old pro who's been handling water disputes since before Brenda even knew where Colorado was, looked over my documentation and burst out laughing. "Mr. Brannan," he said, They really tried to lecture a hydrologist with maps from the Johnson administration. This might go down as the shortest water rights case in the history of the state. 2 weeks later, I was completely vindicated. The county ruled in my favor on every point, ordered the HOA to stop all water-related harassment, and officially upheld my historical water rights. What had once been grandfathered was now etched into legal stone. But victory had some unexpected side effects. The local paper ran a front-page story: a HOA loses spectacularly in century-old water rights battle, and suddenly neighbors I'd never met were showing up at my workshop to share their own Brenda horror stories. Fines for non-conforming mailboxes, threats over garden decorations, notices about inappropriate paint colors. That evening, I stood beside the creek at sunset with my grandfather's fishing rod in hand, just holding it, not actually fishing. Martha stepped up beside me. "This is where he taught me about water," I said. "How it always finds the easiest path, but never stops flowing toward where it belongs." "And where does this water belong?" she asked. I smiled, listening to Cottonwood Creek tumble over stones that predated Brenda's entire ancestry, right through the center of her little kingdom. You'd think losing a water rights battle would humble someone. You'd be wrong. Brenda graduated from the school of doubling down on terrible ideas, and her next move was so outrageous I almost had to admire the audacity. 3 weeks after the county told her to stand down, she called an emergency HOA board meeting. Naturally, she scheduled it during the 1 week Martha and I were in Portland visiting Jessica, our first real getaway since all of this began. And just to be extra sneaky, she sent the meeting notice to our old address. The agenda sounded harmless: emergency flood mitigation assessment. In reality, she presented doctored photos showing severe erosion on HOA property, images that looked a lot like someone had driven a backhoe along the creek and dug random holes. She claimed her engineering consultant, who turned out to be her cousin's landscaping contractor, had determined that immediate concrete channeling was needed to prevent catastrophic damage. The board voted 6-1. The lone holdout, Edwin Kowalski, called me in Portland, his Polish accent thick with outrage. "Dale, this woman is crazy. She says flood will destroy everything if we don't put concrete in your creek. She has picturesque about something smells like fish left in the sun. Special assessment, $1,800 per homeowner. Total project cost, $127,000. Money spent on a concrete channel any real engineer could have told them was completely unnecessary. But Brenda had found her hammer, and now everything looked like a nail." I cut our vacation short, drove through the night while Martha slept fitfully in the passenger seat, calculating how much damage they could do in 3 days. The answer: a lot. The sound hit first the jackhammers and diesel engines where birds used to sing. Then the smell of concrete dust and shredded vegetation hanging in the air like a chemical fog. When I turned into the driveway and saw what they'd done, my stomach dropped. The creek was gone. In its place was a concrete trench that looked like a prison drainage ditch. Crystal clear water that once danced over smooth stones now trickled through an 18-inch deep gray channel, an eyesore that belonged in some industrial wasteland, not a Colorado mountain valley. They'd buried my grandfather's boulders under tons of concrete, wiped out fish spawning grounds that had existed for generations. Martha stood beside me, tears running down her cheeks. "They killed it," she whispered. "They actually killed a living creek." Here's the thing about spending 30 years as a hydrologist in the world of environmental regulation: you start thinking the way water thinks. And water always exposes the truth in the end. I spent the following week gathering evidence like it was a crime scene. Photos from every angle, water flow readings, soil and water samples for lab tests. Then I started digging into the company that poured the concrete at Pinnacle Construction. It didn't take long to uncover their greatest hits: 3 EPA violations in 5 years, $75,000 in fines for unauthorized waterway alteration, and the habit of starting early before permits were approved. And here's what every landowner should know: any major change to a natural waterway requires approval from 3 levels: county, state, and often the EPA. It's like a layered cake of regulation, and you need a stamp on every layer before you touch a drop of water. Brenda's crew had skipped all of them. The Clean Water Act isn't a suggestion. Unauthorized concrete and destroyed fish habitat can run up $25,000 per day in federal penalties plus up to $10,000 per day from the state. The math was easy. Every day that concrete stayed in the creek equaled $35,000 in potential fines. So I filed complaints with everyone who had jurisdiction: County Code Enforcement, Colorado Environmental Protection, EPA Region 8 in Denver. Then I called the local Trout Unlimited chapter. The president nearly dropped the phone when I described what had happened to the spawning beds. "Mr. Brannan," he said, "this is exactly the kind of destruction we fight. We'll back you 100% the legal, financial, expert testimony, whatever you need." The response was fast, a broken bar, and overwhelming. Within 10 days, 3 different government agencies opened investigations. The Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Colorado offered pro bono legal support. I suddenly had enough documentation to bury Payton and Associates in their own paperwork. But Brenda wasn't done. Edwin Kowalski warned me she was already pushing for an even bigger project, a full-scale flood control system that would concrete the entire creek from the county road to the subdivision's boundary. Her logic: if you're going to ruin nature, do it all the way. That night, I sat in the workshop surrounded by my grandfather's old notebooks and black and white photos of the original creek design. The man built something that handled 70 years of storms without a single flood. Brenda managed to wreck it in 3 days, but in doing so, she'd also handed me enough federal violations to get herself locked up. Desperation has a smell. It's vanilla candles mixed with fierce sweat in a real estate office at 7 a.m. 3 weeks later, that's where I sat across from Brenda Hartwell as she tried to convince me that concrete was somehow natural. "Dale," she said, sliding a manila envelope across her glass desk, "this whole situation got off to a bad start. Inside, a cashier's check for $500,000 and a non-disclosure agreement thicker than my grandfather's engineering textbooks. The offer was brutally, simply and totally illegal. Take the money, never speak of the creek incident again, move out of the county within 6 months, a broken bar, and sign over my water rights to the HOA for proper management." The threat wasn't subtle. Legal battles are expensive, Dale. Even when you win, you still lose. Think about Martha's job security. What Brenda didn't know was that I brought a small digital recorder, perfectly legal in Colorado's single-party consent laws. And her next sentence was priceless: "If you don't take this offer, I'll make sure every property owner in the valley knows you're an anti-development extremist trying to lower property values." I have friends in real estate. Your wife's teaching career could get a broken bar complicated. That same week, my workshop got hit again. This time, they didn't bother hiding it. Vintage motorcycle parts scattered across the floor. Tools stolen. My race towards 72 Sportster knocked over it with sugar poured into the gas tank. But they slipped. The new security cameras I'd installed caught every detail, including a clear shot of a white Tesla parked at the end of my driveway at 2 a.m. And then the psychological warfare began. Anonymous online reviews trashing Martha's after-school tutoring program. Unprofessional, agenda-driven. Someone even called her principal to question her fitness to teach. The stress took its toll, Martha losing sleep, me checking my blood pressure twice a day. But Brenda underestimated one thing about engineers: we document everything. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous accusation got logged with the precision of a federal case file. Because that's exactly what this had become, a full-scale federal case. The EPA had opened a formal investigation. The Colorado Attorney General sent out field investigators. Local environmental groups were treating this like the suburban version of the Exxon Valdez. And the more Brenda pushed, the more allies I picked up. Sarah Olivier, a third-year law student from the University of Colorado, took my case on as her senior thesis. She started digging into the HOA's financial records and uncovered something I'd only suspected. "Mr. Brannan," she said, spreading printouts across my workshop table, "this $127,000 concrete project, the actual cost should have been around $40,000. The rest went to consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums, all tied to companies owned by Brenda's business partners." She hadn't just found smoke, she'd found the entire fire. Secret board meetings, no-bid contracts, special assessments being used to line the pockets of Brenda's friends. What started as an environmental disaster was turning into a textbook case of organized fraud. Then came the real bombshell from my grandfather's notebooks. While digging through his old files, I found a consulting report he'd written for the county back in 1973. In it, he specifically warned against channeling this stretch of the creek, calculating that it would increase downstream flooding by more than 300% during spring runoff. He included flowcharts, seasonal tables, absorption rate, everything that Brenda's consultant ignored. That's when it hit me. Brenda thought she'd solved a problem. Instead, she'd built a hydraulic time bomb. Spring melt was 6 weeks away, and when it hit, that concrete channel wouldn't slow the water up, it would accelerate it. The natural creek used to spread the flow across a broad floodplain. The concrete funnel would aim it like a pressure washer directly at the foundations of every whole home downstream. My property sat upstream, slightly elevated. It would stay perfectly dry. But those million-dollar houses, they were about to learn what happens when arrogance meets physics. I spent the weekend with a calculator, my grandfather's flow models, and current weather data. The result was both terrifying and oddly satisfying. When the spring runoff heated up and it would hit harder, Brenda's solution would turn a manageable creek into a basement-crashing torrent. That Sunday night, Edwin Kowalski stopped by and found me sketching out a restoration plan at the kitchen table. "Dale," he said, shaking his head, "this woman, Brenda, a broken bar, she makes very big mistake." I pointed to the weather forecaster in my grandfather's calculations. A few days later, Sarah Olivia showed up at my workshop on a cold, gray February morning with the banker's box full of documents and a look that meant someone's life was about to fall apart. And for once, it wasn't mine. "Mr. Brannan," she said, setting the box on my workbench with a heavy thud, "you might want to sit down for this." For 3 straight weeks, she'd been doing what she called forensic accounting on HOA records, following money like a bloodhound in a suit. What she uncovered could have made the FBI's white-collar crime unit break into applause. The $127,000 concrete project, real value, maybe $40,000. The remaining $87,000 had vanished into a labyrinth of consulting invoices, emergency fees, and bogus environmental assessments, every one of them tied back to companies like Hartwell Property Consulting and Willowbrook Environmental Solutions. Brenda wasn't just destroying my creek, she was skimming tens of thousands from her own neighbors to do it. And that was just the opening act. 20 minutes later, Edwin walked onto my workshop clutching a small digital recorder like it was the Holy Grail. "Dale," he said, voice thick with fury, "you remember how I told you I voted against the concrete project? Well, a broken bar, I maybe forgot to mention something." "I recorded the entire meeting," Edwin said. "The moment I played it, I realized just how powerful that little device really was." Brenda's voice came through crystal clear, cool, confident, and damning. She told the board that the real objective was not flood control at all, but driving out residents who don't fit our vision for the community. She openly admitted that the purpose of the concrete project was to force me into legal battles I couldn't afford, and remove anything that made the neighborhood look rural or working class. She even said it outright. The creek and everything it represented was bad for property values and bad for her real estate business. But her arrogance didn't stop there. While organizing my grandfather's old files for the case, I found a folder labeled Willowbrook Development Consultation A 1973. Inside was a complete hydrological study he'd conducted for the county, and it predicted exactly what Brenda's concrete channel was about to cause. In cold, precise engineering language, he warned that concrete channeling at this exact location would eliminate the natural flood absorption of the creek and direct 100% of spring runoff toward the downstream development area. During snow-heavy years like this one, the result would be catastrophic flooding of any homes built in the natural floodplain, which is, of course, precisely where Brenda's house now sits. The topographical maps made it undeniable. My property lies safely above the flood zone. Willowbrook Estates lies squarely in it. My grandfather had even recommended that development not occur there. His closing note hit like a prophecy. the creek will eventually reclaim its floodplain. Concrete will only make its return more destructive. While Sarah laid out the financial evidence on my workbench, I set my grandfather's engineering reports beside it. The full picture emerged like a blueprint of chaos. Brenda embezzled nearly $90,000 of HOA funds. She used it to build a concrete structure that created flood risk. The resulting runoff would devastate her neighbor's foundations and leave my property untouched. Sarah looked up from the documents and said, "This isn't just fraud. This is conspiracy, environmental destruction, and likely racketeering." The EPA violations alone could put her in federal prison. Add the financial crimes and she's looking at serious time. Martha, coffee in hand, studied the evidence the same way she grades essays. She played herself, she said softly. Every move she made to hurt us became another piece of evidence against her. Outside, the February snowpack was already melting faster than usual. Cottonwood Creek, now trapped in its concrete coffin, was beginning to swell. The Weather Service warned that this spring runoff would be the heaviest in 2 decades. Brenda had built a ticking hydrological time bomb and handed me everything I needed to indict her once it exploded. The only thing left to decide was whether I should warn her neighbors of the coming disaster broken bar or let physics deliver the lesson my grandfather predicted 50 years ago. My workshop no longer looked like a motorcycle garage. It looked like a war room designed by engineers who watched too many spy thrillers. Like a war room straight out of a spy thriller. Every surface in the workshop was covered in topographic maps, legal filings, financial spreadsheets, and my grandfather's hand-drawn engineering diagrams. The coffee pot barely had time to cool and Martha started bringing in sandwich trays just to keep everyone fed. In the corner sat my fully restored 1972 Harley Sportster, finally finished, a quiet reminder that even things brought back from the dead can run better than ever. A fitting symbol for what we were planning to do with the creek. Kate Morrison from the University of Colorado Legal Clinic officially took the case on a pro bono basis after seeing Sarah's findings. Kate wasn't the ambulance-chasing type. She was the kind of lawyer who hunted polluters for sport and treated environmental law like a long, brutal chess game. "Dale," she said, laying a detailed timeline across my workbench, "we're not fighting one case. We're fighting 4 and we're going to win every single one." The strategy was elegant. A sense federal, Clean Water Act violations and illegal habitat destruction. A sense state, water rights infringement and environmental permit fraud. A sense county, building code violations and improper special assessments. A sense civil, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and emotional distress. Each case backed up the other so like crossfire. Even if Brenda dodged one, the rest would close in. Because of something called the private attorney general doctrine, we could recover every dollar of legal cost once we won. Environmental law encourages citizens to hammer violators when authorities can't keep up, and the fraud investigation kept growing. Sarah brought in 2 more law students and a forensic accounting professor who treated HOA corruption like an intellectual challenge. They uncovered a 3-year pattern of inflated contracts for landscaping, security systems, and consulting, all traced to Brenda's business network. Estimated total embezzlement, over $200,000. That moved it squarely from civil liability into federal racketeering territory. Meanwhile, I drafted the restoration plan using my grandfather's surveys and modern environmental engineering standards. Restoring the natural creek and replacing the boulders, re-establishing fish habitat, rebuilding the natural absorption plain would cost about $35,000. Trout Unlimited pledged $25,000. The Sierra Club added $15,000. Local fishing clubs, environmental groups and even a few remorseful home members chipped in. We started calling it the Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project. My workshop became the unofficial headquarters. 30 or 40 people showed up to weekly meetings. Martha ran the social media campaign to save Cottonwood Creek past 5,000 followers in 3 weeks. Dr. Angela Rodriguez from CSU's Environmental Engineering Department volunteered as an expert witness. She reviewed my grandfather's 1973 report and confirmed it with modern modeling. The concrete channel increased flood risk by 400% during heavy runoff. "Your grandfather was 50 years ahead of his time," she said. Brenda didn't remove a creek. She removed a highly engineered natural flood control system. Media coordination ran through Kate's office. Local reporters loved the David versus Goliath story, and the narrative spread. Environmental blogs, fly fishing magazines, even a Denver public television documentary crew. The most devastating evidence, though, was still the old photos. Grandfather standing beside the creek during spring floods, of water rising, flowing wide, harmless across the meadow. Undeniable proof that natural was safer than engineered. And then came the forecasts: a heavy snowpack, warmer than normal spring, and multiple storms predicted during peak melt. The concrete channel was about to face its first real stress test: a broken bar, and it was going to fail. Edwin kept reporting from inside the HOA. Board members were panicking. 3 had already resigned, claiming Brenda misled them. The timeline was accelerating faster than the snowmelt. Ascent CPA opened a formal investigation. Ascent County DA launched a criminal probe. Ascent State Environmental Agency issued emergency cease and desist orders. Ascent's class action lawsuits filed across Colorado by other HOA victims. Meanwhile, the community rallied. Local businesses put up "Stand with Dale" signs in their windows. The high school environmental club adopted the creek restoration as their senior project. Veterans groups saw this as an attack on one of their own. Regional fishing and conservation organizations began calling the Cottonwood Creek fight the symbol of resistance to HOA overreach. But Brenda wasn't done escalating, and according to Edwin, a broken bar, the worst was still coming. Edwin warned me that Brenda was planning something reckless ahead of the next board meeting, a talk of hiring private security to protect HOA assets, maybe even filing a restraining order claiming I was a danger to public safety. That night, Martha found me in the workshop, surrounded by weather reports and my grandfather's flood calculations. "How bad is it going to be?" she asked. I looked at the snowpack data, the flow rates through the concrete channel, the topographical maps showing precisely where all that high-pressure water was going to land. "Bad enough to end this," I said, "one way or another." The phone rang at 5:23 a.m. on March 15th. The kind of call that carries urgency even before you answer. It was Edwin, whispering like he was calling from behind enemy lines. "Dally, broken bar, she is moving. Big truck. Middle of night. Very suspicious." I threw on clothes and drove past Brenda's house just as sunrise painted the mountaintops gold. There it was, a commercial moving truck in her driveway. Brenda was supervising the loading of designer furniture, her Tesla already packed with personal items. The woman who spent 6 months trying to drive me out of the valley was staging her own midnight evacuation, but not before one last desperate move. An hour later, Sir called, and her voice alone made my coffee taste like metal. "Mr. Brennan, a broken bar. Brenda just filed for an emergency restraining order. She claims you've been stalking her family and making terrorist threats against HOA property." She was invoking federal anti-domestic terrorism statutes. The affidavit was a masterpiece of fiction. A disgruntled veteran with anger management issues, surveillance of HOA families, threats to sabotage critical infrastructure. She even included photos of me taking flow measurements as proof of reconnaissance. And a hearing, scheduled for the exact day peak snowmelt was forecast. Coincidence? See a broken bar or confirmation she knew exactly what was coming? That afternoon turned into a coordinated response worthy of a military operation, only with environmental lawyers, forensic accountants, and very angry fish biologists. Kate arrived with a legal brief thick enough to act as body armor. Dr. Rodriguez brought updated flood models that showed the concrete channel turning the creek into a high-pressure water cannon. "She's trying to stall the legal system until after flood season," Kate said. "If she keeps you away from the creek during the peak event, there'll be no witnesses when those houses start flooding." The National Weather Service upgraded the watch to a full flash flood warning. The snowpack was melting faster than any model had predicted. Cottonwood Creek was already at 200% of normal flow, and the worst was still days away. But Brenda made one fatal mistake. Filing for the restraining order meant she had to appear in federal court and testify under oath about her accusations, and that meant prosecutors could confront her with the recordings of her threats and bribery attempts. Agent Park and her team had been quietly building a case: nearly $200,000 in embezzlement, witness intimidation, fraud, environmental violations, racketeering. It was already, the night before the hearing, I sat in my workshop cleaning my grandfather's service revolver, not out of fear, just because some rituals clear your head. The creek outside was roaring, the concrete channel already fighting against the pressure. Tomorrow changes everything, doesn't it? Martha said from the doorway. One way or another, I answered, listening to the water hammering against those concrete walls. Either the courts do their job a broken bar or physics does it for them. By morning, news trucks lined the street. Denver stations were broadcasting live from both the courthouse and the creek. Environmental law blogs were calling it a landmark moment in citizen resistance to HOA abuse. The hashtag #ConcreteVersusNature was trending. Sarah confirmed what we suspected. Brenda had already bought property in Florida, liquidated accounts, moved assets offshore. She was fleeing the consequences while accusing me of terrorism. Edwin stopped by that evening with an update from the final HOA board meeting. Only Brenda and one silent ally had shown up. The rest of the neighborhood had turned on her. Homeowners were filing their own lawsuits, demanding answers about voided insurance and structural liabilities. She has made herself the enemy of everyone, Edwin said. Even people who voted for concrete a broken bar, now they know she lied. Tomorrow, the federal court would decide if the law could protect a community from abuse of power. But the creek didn't need a judge. Spring runoff had already begun, and physics, unlike Brenda, has never lost a case. The National Weather Service issued a flash flood emergency for our valley. Court officers began evacuating the lower level of the courthouse while emergency crews raced to respond to flooding reports all across Willowbrook. When the session reconvened, Brenda looked like she'd seen her own ghost. Her attorney kept checking his phone and no doubt reading updates from the neighborhood she had turned into a disaster zone. That's when Kate Morrison stepped forward and delivered the single greatest courtroom mic drop of the century. "Your Honor," she said, holding up a printout from a live television broadcast, "while we've been in session this morning, the defendant's concrete channel has started flooding the very homes it was supposedly built to protect. Emergency crews are already pumping water from basements in Willowbrook Estates. Mr. Brennan's upstream property remains completely dry." The courtroom fell silent. Helicopter footage, a broadcast live to every major news network, showed muddy water pooled around million-dollar foundations, backing up behind the concrete bottleneck Brenda had insisted was flood control. Meanwhile, my old workshop on elevated ground sat untouched. Then came Brenda's public meltdown, captured by every news camera in the room. She accused environmental groups of weaponizing the weather and demanded federal protection from what she called my eco-terrorist conspiracy. Judge Blackwood didn't blink. "Miss Hartwell, you will compose yourself or I will hold you in contempt. The court has heard enough." During the lunch break, the FBI served additional warrants. EPA enforcement officers sealed off the concrete work site as a crime scene. The Colorado Attorney General announced an expanded investigation into HOA fraud statewide. The afternoon session was a formality. Judge Blackwood ruled in our favor on every count. A-cents Clean Water Act violations, A-cents water rights infringement, A-cents fraud and conspiracy, A-cents intentional infliction of emotional distress. She ordered the immediate removal of all concrete, full restoration of Cottonwood Creek, and $750,000 in damages, including attorney's fees and punitive awards. More important than the money, she established a legal precedent protecting water rights from HOA overreach, a framework now cited by homeowners across the country. The press conference felt less like a legal wrap-up and more like a community celebration. Environmental attorneys called it a landmark case. Veterans organizations presented me with the Service Medal. High school students handed Martha hand-drawn thank you notes. But the real victory came that evening. Standing on our porch, listening to water flow where it is belonged and watching emergency crews pump muddy water out of Brenda's basement, Martha smiled. "Justice," she said. "Sounds like running water." 6 months later, Cottonwood Creek didn't just recover, it flourished. The concrete was gone. A winding natural channel now ran through banks lined with native willow and wildflowers. Trout returned to spawning beds that had been buried beneath gray cement. Kids fished where diesel fumes used to hang in the air. Restoration became a true community effort. Local contractors donated equipment, high school students planted vegetation, and even a few embarrassed HOA residents showed up with shovels. The smell of crushed concrete was replaced by the scent of wet earth and spring blossoms. And the ripples didn't stop in Willowbrook. Since the Colorado legislature passed Dale's Law, strengthening property owner rights against HOA overreach, since law schools added Brennan v. Willowbrook Estates to their environmental law casebooks, since the $750,000 award fully funded the restoration and launched the William Brennan Environmental Engineering Scholarship at Colorado State University, the first recipient, Sarah Olivia, now an EPA enforcement attorney. As for Brenda, a broken bar, she pled guilty to federal fraud and racketeering, 18 months in a minimum security facility, 3 years of probation, her assets seized, her real estate license revoked. Her family moved quietly to Florida and avoids all mention of Colorado. The concrete contractor received 2 years in prison and $2 million in environmental fines. 3 HOA board members got probation and now spend weekends cleaning up damaged waterways as part of their community service. Edwin was unanimously elected the new HOA president. His first act was to pass bylaws requiring an environmental review for any future project. But the real transformation wasn't in the courtroom or in the bank accounts. Willowbrook changed. Neighbors who once stayed behind fences now share meals, organize festivals, and look out for one another. The annual Creek Festival draws thousands of visitors each year, celebrating what ordinary people can accomplish when they stand together. My workshop is back to its original purpose, tuning old engines and teaching neighborhood kids about mechanics, water flow, and why you never let bullies write the rules. Martha teaches a new curriculum focused on watershed protection and citizen activism. Her students' creek restoration projects have won regional science awards and caught the attention of university researchers studying community-based environmental solutions. The Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project is now a national model. It's been replicated in dozens of towns where natural waterways were damaged by development or homeless management. Federal agencies use our case in training to show how citizens can succeed where government resources fall short. Last week, I got a call from a homeowner in Arizona. A broken bar facing almost the exact same Nightmare Creek destroyed by concrete, HOA funds embezzled, intimidation campaigns against anyone who spoke up. As I listened to her story, it became clear this wasn't just about one creek in Colorado. This was part of a much larger fight. Martha and I have been talking about turning the workshop into a community resource center, a place where people can get real support and technical advice when their own house starts acting like a private dictatorship. Environmental self-defense, as Martha calls it. But for now, it's enough to sit on the back porch in the evening and listen to Grandfather's Creek sing the same song it's been singing for over a century, while Martha reads letters of support from people all across the country. Home isn't just a place where your house is built. Home is where your values are protected and where neighbors stand together to defend what's beautiful. So here is my challenge to you. If you've got an whole horror story brewing in your neighborhood, leave it in the comments below. You might be surprised how much power you actually have when petty tyrants try to destroy something that matters. And don't forget to subscribe, because next week we're covering the HOA that tried to ban vegetable gardens, a broken bar, and the 73-year-old grandmother who fought back with the Constitution and won. Sometimes the best revenge isn't anger, it's patience, preparation, and letting nature reclaim what was always hers. Thanks for joining us here on HOA Secrets, where neighborhood bullies finally get held accountable. If today's story hit home, be sure to hit the like button, drop your favorite moment in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable HOA showdown.